Throughout time, the planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
The planet has shaped all life.
But now, in the era of the human, we are shaping the planet.
And truthfully, we are not doing a good job at it yet. Our actions are putting a lot of pressure on the world. Just look at 2020 with COVID-19, extreme weather, and rampant wildfires. People have created this mess, but we can fix it.
Empowered people can become agents of their own destiny. The world may seem stuck in its own ways, but we can take actions to create a new normal, whether that's expanding the role of women in society or using cleaner energy.
In too many countries, fossil fuels remain the primary source of energy, but clean alternatives like solar power will help reduce our carbon emissions. These alternatives need to be made accessible and affordable without using too much of other finite resources.
And we must learn to harness the power of nature at the same time as we protect its beauty and wonder. Moving to protect, sustainably manage and restore ecosystems in a way that promotes well-being.
Too often, the decisions of a few people or countries hurt the most vulnerable people across the world. For all of us to flourish now and into the future, we must understand that we are all connected. The choices you make impact the whole world around you.
Shaping the planet means
taking bold steps.
Bold steps for humans to survive and thrive in this new era.
If we are going to change the world,
we need you.
We need you.
We need you, our global leaders, to take bold action now.
Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Céline Moirot. I'm the resident representative for UNDP in Lebanon. And on behalf of the United Nations Development Programs and the Carnegie Middle East Center, I would like to welcome you to the launch of the Human Development Report in the Arab State region. I think we will have a very good audience turnout today, which in my view is to be expected because the report that we are launching today is not just any report. It goes beyond summarizing the well-known problems and putting forward policy options. It rises to the unprecedented moment in our history, a moment of truly global multidimensional crisis, by helping us understand what we are experiencing and how to seize the present moment to reset the world in the interest of long-term survival of people and planet. What we are experimenting today is the shock of a new geological era, the Anthropocene, or the era of humans, a moment in history when the impact of human behavior on the planet is greater than ever before. In this sense, the crisis of our time, climate change, growing inequality, the COVID-19 pandemic, are manifestations of the pressures in which humans have been collectively putting on our planetary system in the pursuit of progress over the last 100 years. The strain we have put on our planetary system is now being mirrored in our societies. Planetary imbalances and social imbalances are reinforcing each other in a vicious cycle caused by humans in the pursuit of progress. The report that we will present today and discuss, particularly in the context of the Arab State region, is clear on how to begin to break this cycle. The starting point is the acknowledgement that the era of humans is an age defined by human choice, where we, human, pose the greatest threats, but also the greatest opportunity for long-term survival of people and planet. So what do we need to do to survive and thrive in this new age? The report argues that we must choose a path of social, economic, and environmental transformation designed to balance social and planetary system, a reimagined human development journey. So as we reflect on the conclusion of the report, let us be reminded of the impact of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has been called a portal, and indeed the metaphor is apt. We hope to focus our discussion today on how we can use the process of building forward better from COVID-19 as a doorway to a new development, human development pathway, one that empowers people to act in favor of our planet and that jumpstart the transformation of our societies and economies. So before we begin our discussion, let me tell you a little bit how our launch will take place. First, we will have a presentation by the lead author of the report and the director of the Human Development Report Office, Dr. Pedro Conceição. We are lucky to have Pedro with us today to begin the reimagining of the human development journey in the region and to walk us through some of the choices that all countries need to embrace as they build forward better from the COVID-19 pandemic. Following Pedro's presentation, we will hear from a very important panel of experts that will join us in an interactive conversations about the report and how to take its findings forward. While I will introduce each of the panelists in detail when we start the panel segment, allow me to welcome Ambassador Janet Rogan of the UK, Ms. Maha Yahya, the Director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, and Dr. Khalida Boussar, the Director of the UNDP Regional Director for Arab State. The main segment of our event today will also be the interactive discussions, which will follow the panel discussions. I would like to invite you to take the opportunity to type any questions or comments that you may have in the Q&A functions that you see on Zoom. The Q&A functions will be moderated by colleagues from the Human Development Report Office, meaning that some of the questions that you may ask, they will be addressed by them directly. Others will be read out by myself and addressed to the panel members for feedback and additional insight during the open discussion segment of our event. So without further ado, I would like to welcome again Pedro as the main lead author to present the main findings of the report. Pedro, over to you.
Thank you, Celine. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be given this opportunity to present and discuss the 2020 Human Development Report. All regional launches of human development reports are important, of course, but I should say that the human development concept and regional human development reports have had particular resonance in this region. And so we hope that the event today and the discussion with Janet, Khalida, Maha will really be the beginning of a conversation about the implications of our 2020 Human Development Report for the region. So I'll try to be brief, and I just would like to highlight three key messages of the 2020 Human Development Report. First, you already mentioned many of the points I'm going to make related to this first message, Celine. The report can be seen as an invitation to look at challenges such as COVID-19 or the climate change emergency, really not as separate problems, but as reflections of this unprecedented moment in our history and the history of our planet, where human pressures are driving planetary changes that are dangerous. Dangerous to us, humans, but also to all life on the planet. This has actually been described, as you indicated, Celine, as a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, even though the formal designation is not fully established. And we emphasize in the report that it brings along an unprecedented set of risks that are of our own making. And in a way, COVID-19 could be seen as an illustration of these types of risks. We don't know for sure, but it's likely that the virus that causes COVID-19 jumped from animals to humans. But we do know that there's been an increase in the frequency of zoonotic diseases, and this increase is related to the pressures that we're putting on the planet. So the 2020 report is really an attempt to reflect on meeting the goal of continuing to expand human development that has animated human development reports for the last 30 years as we go deeper into this new context of the Anthropocene. The second key message, and you already alluded to this as well, Celine, is that we are not only facing new types of risks, but they are actually superimposed onto a world with large and often growing inequalities. And these inequalities are often exacerbated by these risks. If we take COVID-19 again as an example, we know that the impact has been worse for women than for men. In part because the sectors that were more affected are sectors in which women are overrepresented, but also because social norms related to the expectation of the role of women in childcare or homework seem to be reasserting themselves. So we have evidence that many women are pulling back from the labor force. We document in the report drops of as much as 10 percentage points in the labor force participation rate of women. And this, of course, represents a reversal of progress that in many cases had taken decades to achieve. But this relation, this pattern actually holds more broadly. As you can see on the slide, countries that face more ecological threats, droughts, floods, storms, are also those where gender inequality is higher. And if we consider inequality in human development more broadly, we see that the story is very much the same. Now, inequalities are also linked to gaps in consumption and in power between those that extract and pollute excessively and those bearing the consequences of these actions. So we report we report that by the end of this century, the poorest countries in the world who have contributed the least to climate change could experience up to 100 days more of extreme temperature. These are represented by the red lines on the slide. While rich countries, which have historically contributed the most, could actually experience 18 days less of extreme temperature. But as the blue lines on the slide also show, those 100 days could be cut in half by getting closer to meeting the aspirations of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So whatever happens going forward is not inevitable and depends on our choices. And this brings me to the third and last message, and I will conclude with this. Human development is not only about people's well-being and redefining what it means to assess development by looking at more than just income on how the economy is performing. It's also about seeing people as agents of change, but this calls for giving people conditions to make different choices. So in the 2020 HDR, we supplement the Human Development Index with a new index of planetary pressures that combines indicators of both material footprint per person and carbon dioxide emissions per capita. If we plot the current values of these two indices for all countries, we see that the aspirational space of high human development and low planetary pressures that is shown by this flashing triangle on the slide is currently empty. The blue dots show the position of countries on these two indicators. So to take us there, the report lays out three mechanisms to encourage people to make different choices. First, harnessing social norms. Much policy analysis is sometimes premised on the idea that each person is an island making rational calculations on how to behave. But humans are actually an ultra-social species. So a key predictor of what we do is what others around us do and expect us to do. So we've seen that social norms around things like using masks or smoking in shared spaces have changed, sometimes quite rapidly. So we argue in the report that we must harness social norms also to give greater weight to easing planetary pressures. Second, prices and regulation can be used to shift economic incentives, which are crucial in our economies, in our society. So carbon prices and the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies are examples of the changing incentives that would be helpful in easing planetary pressures. But the report emphasizes the importance of incentives and investments in research, technology, and innovation. And here we look beyond the deployment and greater diffusion of many of the technologies that we know would make a difference, many of which are already competitive on a price basis today, and could be deployed at larger scale with stronger incentives. For instance, when it comes to renewable energies, we know that is the case for solar energy. But it emphasizes the importance of investing in continuing to invest in research in science, to harness what has been called our collective brain, to continue to expand the frontier of knowledge. Because we've learned from history that what often seems like a wonderful technological fix can bring along unintended consequences. And then third, we suggest that it's important to look at nature not as a constraint, but actually as a potential opportunity to both advance human development while at the same time protecting and restoring ecosystems. Our administrator, Achim Steiner, often speaks of our ecological infrastructure that is as important, if not more important, ultimately, than our physical infrastructure. So this includes protecting and restoring forests or investing in the blue economy of our oceans, both of which are examples of how preserving ecosystems can also give opportunities for long-lasting economic advancement. So let me stop here, Celine. I just want to finalize by coming back to inequalities, or what we call in the report social imbalances, as you mentioned. And these are inequalities not only in resources, in income and wealth, but in power and voice. And these are often standing in the way of implementing these mechanisms of change that I just alluded to. Just as an example, the contribution of indigenous peoples on a per person basis to manage forests that work as a carbon sink is roughly equivalent, according to our estimates, to the carbon dioxide emissions per person of the top 1% of the global income distribution. And these indigenous peoples are the very people that are often marginalized around the world. So it's an illustration of the imbalances in power and in voice between those that are taking action to ease planetary pressures and those that are contributing to making them worse. So these imbalances are putting people and planet on a collision course, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can make different choices, and our aspiration is that the 2020 Human Development Report will help to move us towards meeting the aspirations of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for this very comprehensive overview, I think, of the many findings and recommendations of the report. I think it's a solid basis to, I'm sure, for questions to be asked to you and the panelists, and then I think to a very substantive conversation. So thanks again for your insights. Let me turn now to the segment of our program focusing a little bit, zooming in on the Arab state regions to make sense of both the findings and the recommendations that you've just highlighted in the context of the Arab state region. So as I was saying, we're very pleased to have Khalida Boussar, Janet Rogan, and Mayami Yahya to be here with us to discuss and to make sense of the findings in our region. So without further ado, I will maybe move to Khalida. For first, I will take 2 rounds of questions, and then we will open for discussion with the audience. Khalida, you come from a long and rich background in sustainable development and energy and environment and climate in the region and globally, including in your current role leading the UNDP work in the Arab state region. I have a 2-part question for you. Based on the introduction from Pedro, what new insight do you think the report gives us on the link between climate change, inequality, and poverty as applied to the Arab state region? And then secondly, what do you think are the main takeaways for countries in the region in that context? Thanks again.
Thank you, Celine, and good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. Thanks to UNDP Lebanon for for hosting this important event. My thanks to, sorry, I'm repeating Celine's, but I think it's important we recognize our partners. Janet, thank you very much for being here and helping us to explore strategic implication and practical consequences for our region from your important perspective as a COP 2016 regional ambassador. Thanks to Pedro for this wonderful report. And last but not least, thanks to Dr. Yahya from the Carnegie Middle East Center for your partnership and being here to shed some light on the implication of this report in the region. Celine, you had very, very good questions. I think I will start by the main takeaway. I mean, for me, the main takeaway message is that business as usual is not an option. The region is bombarded, if I can use this word, and surrounded by many issues. We tend to think that the region is only exposed to crisis, but it's not the case. If you look across, the oil-producing countries have been also affected, and they are facing big economic challenges. So against this backdrop and background and the dark picture, if I can say it, because we have so many challenges, youth unemployment, lack of gender empowerment, more impact on employment, water scarcity, food insecurity in some of the countries, high dependence on food import. So we have many challenges, but I think time has come to turn these challenges into opportunities. Let me tell you maybe a few examples, or maybe to shed some light on my thoughts. Last week, I was participating in a workshop in Algeria. You know that Algeria is an oil-producing country, and you think that they might continue the same, using fossil fuels, but they have embarked in a huge energy transition to develop renewable energy schemes and solar energy. So this means that there is a change of direction, there is a change of visions, and I think as much as people are affected, I think government realize that there is a need to change. The region is known as being the oil-producing tank, if I can say that for the world, but we don't say enough that we have, the region has a lot of solar energy potentials and exposure to the sun. So this is something that we'll pursue by the government, but also with our help, because we see the solar energy, renewable energy, green recovery as a huge opportunity to create jobs. Don't forget that in the region we have the highest unemployment among the young people. And when I say young, there is a huge divide, gender divide in employment between young men and young women. So for me, the takeaway message is that the challenges are here, but they can be turned into opportunities at different levels. First, in terms of policies, and we need to change policies. Nothing happens only at the local level, so we need to have a change of policies. We need to have a different compact between the people and the nature, and the policies also. We need to recognize the importance of nature and put it at the center. In the region, we have many examples, and I have a list of them. I'm not going to list them all. I mentioned Algeria, but we have also new type of financing emerging from within the countries, like we have the greening, the integrated national financing framework process in Jordan. In Lebanon and Iraq, we have even climate-proof national development plans, which is very important. And in Lebanon, again, Somalia and Yemen streaming green solution into crisis response plans. So we also see this conversion into a new development paradigm as an option, not to solve the crisis, but to be more resilient to crisis, and this is very important. I think maybe the last message is that today, because we are looking at the HDR, that we have to put it in the context of COVID-19. As Pedro has mentioned, it has further exacerbated the inequalities and the inequalities across countries, and this is my main message, not only in crisis countries. So we need to accelerate a green recovery from the economic crisis. And I think we need to act now if we don't want to ruin our future and the future of our kids. Last, Pedro said that we are putting pressure on the resources, but I would like to say it is true. We are putting a lot of pressure on our own resources, but at the end of the day, what does it mean? It means that we are putting pressure on ourselves and compromising our future. Over to you. I hope I answered and it was not too long. Thank you, Celine.
Thank you very much. And I think the motto of business as usual is not an option. I think is a good start for our conversation. Thank you very much, Khalida. I will turn over to Janet. As the UK COP 2016 regional ambassador for the MENA, Eastern Europe and Central Asia region, we're very keen to hear your perspective on the role of international collective action in managing the challenges that are described in the context of the age of the Anthropocene. So my question to you is as follows. What do you see as the most promising avenues to ensure inclusive and sustainable development for all, while also tackling the climate crisis in the region? And in that context, what role do you see for COP 2016 in helping moving some of those conversations forward? Over to you, and thanks again for joining us.
Great, thank you very much, Celine, for inviting me. It's a great honor to be back in the UNDP zone and participating in this regional launch of the latest Human Development Report. Kudos to Pedro and his team. It's a great report, and I look forward to having a good discussion today. As Khalida said, there is a lot of opportunity as well as challenge around at the moment. And this is not only because we have COVID, climate change, and a number of other issues to tackle at the same time, but it's also because we are turning our minds collectively as an international body to new ways of working and of addressing our issues. Let us take COP26, for example. This should have been taking place last year. As we know, it's very important. The significance of this COP, it's 5 years on from Paris, even though we had to defer it by a year. So it's a checkpoint. It should have been a checkpoint moment when we are looking at the progress made so far against the Paris Agreement targets. And also built into the Paris Agreement is a ratchet that after 5 years, we look at how far we've come. And as each country and as the international organizations together, we improve our ambition. And we raise the ambition in order to reach those targets that we need in the remaining 10 years up to 2030. Now, let us just go back and remember, we agreed the Paris Agreement in 2015. We also agreed the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 in 2015. We had Sendai disaster risk reduction in 2015. And actually that comes on the back of what I think is another very significant human development report from UNDP, that of 2014, which was looking at the issue of reducing vulnerabilities and building resilience. And I think that was another seminal kind of human development report where it took a cross-cutting look and tried to understand more of the issues that were facing us. That report talked about multiple vulnerabilities, how to build resilience across the piece, not only within one community, one section of a community, but across. And I think that spirit is followed through into this report on the Anthropocene. And it also informs the way the UK is trying to approach COP26. As the incoming presidency for COP26, we are trying to ensure that when we come out of it, we have a balanced agreement for going forward. That means that we need to look across the piece for mitigation, which is usually expressed in our NDCs, adaptation in an adaptation plan or communication, finance, of course, because without a means of implementation, nothing will happen, and then collaboration, because solidarity in the face of the multiple issues that the world is facing is the only way at the end of the day we will come through. So what does that mean? We are encouraging every party to look again at NDCs. And let me just pay a hat tip to our host government today and say Lebanon has just submitted their second NDC with a heightened level of ambition. So we very much welcome that. When it comes to adaptation, we would also like to encourage countries to come forward with a clear adaptation communication. It doesn't have to be very complicated, but the purpose is to distill down those areas where adaptation is crossing over to human development and national development plans, and where the interlinking resource needs are sitting. This is a very, very complex interplay between the development and the climate change agendas, and resourcing those is really a challenge for many, many countries. So in order to help prioritize where the need is greatest and what is the first need, that's what the adaptation communications are meant to help us do. When it comes to finance, the UK is driving very, very hard to try and increase the commitments and delivery of those commitments from international donor partners, because really we've been lagging behind even before the COVID crisis came along. And as we know, in this region, as in many others, many jobs have been lost, human development has gone backwards. If we are to have any hope of catching up, we must do this in the context of recovering a green recovery from COVID-19 as we move forward. Again, that's what we're trying to get to as we leave COP26 and as we push through into the remaining years. When it comes to collaboration, we're also talking about reaching out to multinational corporations, to the private sector, to say, look, just as sustainable development is not only for governments, it's also for the private sector, it's for civil society, it's for people and communities. It must be bottom up as well as top down. The same applies to climate change. If we want to make really significant changes, we have to do that together. We all have different roles. Governments have a role in regulation and legislation and providing the right environment. The private sector has a massive role in innovation. Private sector concept of risk and risk management is very different from the public sector, and private sector will take a challenge and move forward with it if government requires them to. In the UK, for example, recently Prime Minister Johnson announced that there will be no more sale of new petrol or diesel driven vehicles by 2030. So they will all have to be, the new vehicles will all have to be electric. That means that there has to be a massive change in the private sector for those people who are delivering and selling those vehicles. So government has set a policy, set a standard, and is pulling the industry in that direction. Now, I think the people in the UK are supporting all of that. So it's a three-way approach. So I think when we look at how this is reflected in the today's Human Development Report that's being launched, we see this interplay between climate, between the fears that people have. We see the suffering that we've gone through in the last year and a half and will continue in many places as a result of COVID-19, which is a clear, however it's originated, is a clear evidence of transition between animal diseases and the human population, which is happening more and more frequently. So we see that we suffer when we have this imbalance, when we have these areas where we overlap and we don't regulate them. So our approach to COP26 is really to try and bring a focus into all of those areas, help us as countries, help us as a globe to be able to move in the right direction. So this report on the Anthropocene is really going to help us, I think, to make those arguments more clearly. We have 6 months to COP26, and we really hope that this region, with some of the most forward-leaning when it comes to renewable energy technologies, will be one of those that plays a key role in reaching those targets and setting new targets. Let me stop there because I know we want to discuss this further.
Thank you so much, Janet, for your very comprehensive answer. And I think this emphasis on the need for an integrated agenda and also whole of society responses, I think it speaks very much to some of the kind of the some of the options that are being highlighted in the report in terms of how to take this work forward. Now I will turn to Maha, and I want to thank her and her organizations for agreeing to join us for this launch. Thanks again, Maha, and I'm very pleased to have you with us today. My question is as follows. I mean, I think given your long-standing expertise in the regions on governance, political issues, on issues of democratic transition and development, I'd like to hear from you in terms of the type of transformation you see as necessary in the regions to be able to address some of those imbalances and challenges that Pedro and Janet and Khalida were talking to, and to adapt also to the type of climate emergency that Janet was highlighting. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. And let me take the opportunity first to welcome everybody to this joint panel. I'm absolutely delighted to be co-hosting, for Carnegie to be co-hosting this with UNDP, but also delighted to be also back with UNDP colleagues on this platform. So let me welcome everybody to this event. In quick response to your, and thank you, Pedro, actually, and team for a great report. I found it very enriching, just going through it, and it sort of shifted my perspective on certain things. Let me just quickly respond to your question, which is what needs to be done for this region. But before that, let's just talk about where this region is today. The region overall is facing, this is COVID-19 is literally the fourth crisis to hit it in a decade. And I'm not even talking about the financial crisis of 2008. I'm talking about first the Arab uprisings, then the oil prices, the second wave, and now COVID-19. COVID-19 has exposed fundamental vulnerabilities across the region and has widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots. More importantly, it's coming on the heels of multiple other, I mean, this is a region that's facing a dramatic rollback in development as a result of conflict. There are at least 4 active conflicts across the region, and the number of simmering conflicts below the surface in the region as well. Massive population displacement, not as a result only of climate change in some places, but primarily as a result of conflict, which means a return. And Lebanon itself, you know, the country where we're all in right now, is hosting close to 1 million Syrian refugees whose prospects of going home are incredibly dim at this particular point in time because of policies being enacted in their home, in their own home country. So what needs to be done here, I think the first issue is obviously a sense of regional cooperation. My colleague Marwan Mashal and myself put out a chapter recently where we talked about this as a region of Arab decision-making. It's called basically a coming decade of Arab decisions, where we highlight the way the old Arab order is dead, and then talk about the end of frontierism, the rentier state, etc., and talk about the need to move to a new way forward. And that new way forward can only be if Arab governments begin to invest in their people, because social peace and a sustainable region, sustainable political, environmental, economic, cannot happen and cannot be achieved by force or just through financial incentives. Reforms will actually across the region will ultimately probably cost much less than trying to maintain the status quo, which is what we're seeing now. We also need to build far newer and far stronger institutions, and this means rethinking the social contract, coming back to the old theme of this social contract between states and their citizens. I think that there are 5 areas, strategic shifts that are needed across the region, and I'll mention them very briefly. One is inclusive decision-making. If states are to become self-reliant and basically survive the interim period of not only the needed economic sacrifice, but also potential political turbulence, they have to adopt some sort of inclusive approach to governance of their societies. And this is very much in line with the argument that is made in part in the report, where we talk about empowering citizens at the local level, but also trying to maintain a balance between what is done at the local level and decision makings that are taken at the national and the regional level. We're talking about a region where citizens have very little trust in government and perceive high levels of corruption and inequality. So inclusive decision making is fundamental if we're going to make a transition towards a more sustainable political and developmental era for this particular region. And of course, this means citizens being given a drastic choice. Another area is education. Education for active citizens, and this is something that I think is incredibly important and we cannot emphasize enough. It's not just about the huge number of citizens, and this is why I was talking earlier about the rollback in development in this region, but it's also the need to not only also reform our education system to help empower our students, to help empower the youth in this region, open up ways around critical thinking. But I think also it's to encourage, to have a rethinking of what is an economy for the 21st century supposed to look like? What is the world? What is the 21st century supposed to look like? We're still teaching as if we're still in many ways in the 19th century. For this particular region, it's been decades of emphasis on rote learning. You've heard it all, you've seen it all. So we really need to broaden the focus from just acquiring defined bodies of knowledge to fostering skills of analysis and synthesis, but also meeting the needs of, again, living in the 21st century and what that means for both economy and the environment and social systems. But also in terms of, and this is fundamental for highlighting inequalities, the inequities. Addressing inequalities is not just about income, it's not just about access, and not just about politics, but it's about all of these things. The third is obviously moving economies to more productive economies, and I think here encouraging what has been mentioned by the two previous speakers is incredibly important, because it's not just about moving towards productive economies across the region, but green economies and what that means. Encouraging innovation. I was looking at some of the innovation that is happening today in the areas of climate change, particularly because this is a region where that is one of the world's most exposed to negative climate change impacts. And you still find that the innovation when it comes to climate change is happening in very small circles, and mainly at this point in Gulf countries that have the funding to support this kind of change, but it's not trickling across the region. The innovation needed, but it's not trickling across the region. And the concern here is that we will have a concentration in one area, in one part of the region, and an increasing impoverishment across the rest of the region. The fourth area where we need to, of course, promoting transparency, etc., is all important. The fourth area where we need a fundamental shift is in nurturing pluralism. And frankly, in the 21st century, the wealth of nations will be measured by their human capital. And this region is home to diverse ethnicities, religious communities, and it's a diversity that could be a source of strength. But as we know from other parts of the world, these are not all communities here enjoy the same rights. And we believe that these disparities have kept the region from realizing its full potential, in addition to war, etc. So I think that encouraging pluralism, supporting local communities, encouraging local production of knowledge, but also the way we talk about local populations being custodians of certain ecosystems. This is something that can also be looked at in this particular region. I'm thinking of the water irrigation systems in specific parts, traditional ways of doing things that can be expanded, improved, and that can help in addressing both climate change, but also in giving local populations far more voice. And perhaps the last area where we need the fundamental change is in embracing regional cooperation, something that seems like almost a pipe dream at this particular moment. This is something that has been on the agenda for the past few decades, at least. The need for regional cooperation. We all know the story. But I think today, particularly with the pandemic, with the refugee crisis, the internally displaced crisis, the amount of the resources needed to get different parts of this region back on its feet, the sheer volume of destruction, and we're not even talking about a sustainable planet. We're not talking about the age of Anthropocene. Definitely humans have reshaped and destroyed fundamental parts of this region. So we cannot rebuild if there isn't effective regional cooperation on multiple levels, some sort of a burden sharing approach, but also wealth sharing approach to how we deal with the catastrophes that affected us, and with the understanding that what happens in one part of this region will not stay in that part of this region. Moving into the 21st century has ensured this far more than ever before. I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha, for your comprehensive answer. And I think a perfect segue into what the second part of the conversation with you, Janet and Khalida, should be, which is to move towards what the report says and whether they find relevance in our regions to actually looking to see the type of necessary transformation that we need to happen. And obviously the reports highlights a number of mechanisms for change, around social norms, incentives, regulation, and nature-based solutions. So I think it's a very good highlight and a good segue to that conversation. So I will go back to Khalida for a last round of questions, connecting the discussions on COVID-19 and discussions around how we can take forward some of the recommendations of the report. So Khalida, how do you think the task of building forward better and greener from COVID-19 can help activate some of the mechanisms for changes that are highlighted in the report? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Celine. It seems that I have the most difficult questions. I was listening to the colleagues, and I found it very interesting. And I think I would say a strategy maybe built on three elements. First of all, to come back to what Maha was saying, is the role of the social contract and the citizens. I think it's important that we have the buy-in of the citizens and the populations. But against our background in the region, how can we achieve that? I think we can achieve that by showing the impact of building better, greener, by creating job opportunities for the youth and incentives. There is, for example, one issue that is close to my heart because of my background is the issue of migration from rural to urban areas, where you see young people do not want to be farmers. They want better quality of life. So if we want to build better and give them the opportunity with solar energy or digitalization or anything like that, we need to give them incentives and to advocate for them to have a better life with our support. Now, the other point, I'm not summarizing what the others have said, but the other point which is very important, which was mentioned, citizenship, engagement population. Second one, the government can do as much as possible, but they cannot do everything. We need to take that as granted. The private sector role is equally, if not more important, because of the lack of financing, but also if we talk about sustainability, at the end of the day, the private sector should be the main vehicle for that. So for us in UNDP, we have been working with government to promote de-risking private investment with new policies, and this is how I think we can reach the private sector to take the future of the population into consideration. Last but not least is also to, as I said before, to mainstream this new paradigm, the new new normal, new development into the policies, of the government, with financing that could come from the government, but with the support of UNDP, of the World and the IFI, we can make it. So basically, local level, private sector, government, and I think Janet was saying it needs to be bottom up and top down, and this is how we can meet halfway to make the world better. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalida. Thank you very much for your additional insight. I'll turn to Janet and ask her questions around how this whole conversations fit within discussion on multilateralism. So how does our multilateral system need to evolve to be up to the challenge of building a future where human development and nature can both flourish? In particular, if you can speak to how international cooperation and development aid may need to evolve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a very pertinent question because obviously from the UK perspective, we have tried to take a very balanced approach when it comes to climate change and the funding that we make available, and also from the perspective of COP26 to try and ensure that when funding is provided from ODA, as opposed to from the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, let's deal with them separately, that it is split evenly between mitigation and adaptation. And that's very important because sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on the mitigation, on greenhouse gases, on the emissions side of the house. And that's very important, but not every country is a big emitter. So many countries are actually much more on the side. Of course, they want to limit their emissions as far as they can, but their impact is relatively small in comparison to others. So their focus is much more on adaptation, which is also where we look at how we do a just transition. And a just transition means fair and equitable development within a whole of system approach to our needs. Energy is a very, very important one for this region, not only because you have major oil producers here, but also because you have major options for alternatives. So let me say, if we look at, for example, renewable energy, Lebanon, again, where you're sitting today, has maybe 300 days of sun every year. That is a massive, massive solar resource that renewable technology is now so much cheaper, so much better. It is now possible to consider a transition in energy production across this region into solar, where there is a real crossover between public policy and private sector investment. So when we look at ODA, we want to make sure that that element of funding, which is never going to be the biggest element of funding in any of this, governments, we must remember, national governments and private investment is much bigger than ODA will ever be. But ODA therefore needs to be really focused in the right places and in the right way. So we, for example, we all know that it's much more difficult for many people to access the big global climate funding, whether it's GEF, whether it's Green Climate Fund or one of the other mechanisms. It becomes very technical, it becomes really very challenging. UNDP does fantastic work in supporting governments in making those applications. But we want to try and ensure that the access to the accessibility of that funding, that climate funding that is made available, is easier, is more equitable, and that it is better split between mitigation and adaptation, so that the needs of countries who are more on the adaptive side of the bargain can be taken into account. Because if we don't do that, we really risk those countries being unable to keep up with everybody else when it comes to the green energy transition and this green move going forward, the green recovery that we want to have. Let me just talk about a little bit about the number of jobs. it's estimated that if we really moved on this just transition in energy globally, we could increase jobs in the renewable energy sector by 42 million around the world by 2050. That's a massive number of jobs in a green sector in the economy, which is also supporting a reduction in emissions. In this region, for example, probably if we accelerated the deployment of renewables and the implementation of energy efficiency strategies, we could create over 2 million jobs just in the MENA region by 2050, I would say, by the middle of the century, as opposed to the last number was 500,000, just over 500,000 back in 2017. Again, that's a massive increase. It's a clean increase. It's good value jobs. So I think we need to make sure that we are mainstreaming climate issues, climate resilience, climate responsive programming into everything that we do, ensuring that governments are also mainstreaming climate in the same way in their national and subnational planning and budgeting, that we make sure that we are not just continuing, it's not just business as usual. We know how it goes. Projects can also be business as usual, and we should never have that either. We should always make sure that we are really, and I just want to pick up on one point that Pedro emphasized at the beginning, and it's also there in the Human Development Report. The indigenous people, traditional leaders, and the way they operate and they work are another network of, if you like, small g governance when it comes to the way that our societies function and our economies function, and in protecting and using sustainable use of our natural resources bank. I don't think anywhere in the world probably they really get the attention and the investment from governments or from ODA budgets generally that would be consonant with that level of impact that they have. So I think it's also worth very much looking at how you can encourage that kind of integrated across different types of small g governance within a context to ensure that we're making the best use of those experiences. So actually we will be having in the normal way, we will be supporting a strong indigenous peoples forum at COP26, again to try and bring in that overlap between traditional and indigenous knowledge and the broader sector, and look again at how that can be worked into the funding mechanisms and how our approaches really do the best. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janet. I think it builds to some of the highlights also from Maha around also local knowledge production and how to very much leverage that as part of our strategy moving forward. Maha, I'm coming back to you for a last question. Building on the answer to my initial questions, what do you think are best ways to engage people, particularly youth, to work together with government to take forward some of the actions we need for people in the Arab State region?
Thanks, Celine. Quite honestly, it's not just about engaging the youth. Youth are already engaged. If you look across the region like the rest of the world, it's the youth that are at the forefront of asking for, to take climate change into consideration. Think back to last year and the demonstration, or the year before, I think, the demonstrations that students in Germany and across Europe were holding, particularly on climate issues. For this part of the region, as again, it's about educational systems. I think that it's fundamental that these issues become part of our educational systems. Not only that, but that the tools with which, the tools of critical thinking, of debate, of discussion, be part and parcel of this. The other area I would say also is an innovation and development, investing in innovation across the region, Many of these are, I mean, what we see today, research and development. These are areas that you can also encourage youth to get involved in. For example, I love the idea at one point of creating these fab labs, which are community center labs that allow kids from the communities, not even in structured environments in schools, but to actually experiment with technology. And there could be a special focus on the environment. How do you use local material? How do you use local building techniques to address fundamental issues related to, I mean, I remember when I was in college, as some of you know, I studied architecture, and part of what we looked at was wind, solar, the way Hassan Fathi, who's probably one of the most important architects in this region, God rest his soul, used traditional architectural techniques to build an entire village of Guna, which was self-sustainable, which also had utilized the environment for air conditioning, for heat, etc. These techniques have been around. I mean, modern techniques have been around for decades, but also for this region, it's rich in local knowledge. And I think it's important to go back to some of this and look at it. So these are kinds of the things I would say, but frankly, fundamentally, it's also about governments, because it's not about the youth only making change. I'll come back to Lebanon. Something as basic as recycling of, I mean, Celine, you live here, and you know how challenging it is to have recycling happening across the board. Even though it's not that difficult, you just need the system in place. It's not happening. So without partnerships between, a government-led, policy-led process that also encourages and gives the incentives for people to recycle and the penalty for those who don't recycle, something as simple as that, we're not going to get there.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you very much for your very practical examples of things that needs to be done and could be done. So I think this will conclude our panel discussions, and I would like to thank our three panelists, and I'm particularly happy, I have to mention it, that those are three female panelists. I was very pleased that this was the panel that we had. I think it's not always the case. So thanks again. I think it just speaks to also the future we want to be and to see. So thank you very much. I will now move to the segment on question and answers. I think we have had a few questions, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at my phone because the questions are being sent to me via my WhatsApp. I will give you a few questions, and then maybe ask a different member of the panels, and maybe Pedro also to provide some insight. I think the first question relates to maybe Pedro. That's a question to you, to the new metrics that was introduced in the report. Can you maybe let us know a little bit more in what ways this new metric introduced in the report with new measurements of human development? In what ways is it useful, and how can we further build upon it as we engage in this kind of new journey on human development? Pedro, are you still with us?
Yes, Celine, I'm here. Thank you. It's a very good question. I think the most important thing to bear in mind is the reasoning that led to the choice of indicators and to the choice of the index. The thinking around the environment and sustainability, and as it relates to human development, has been part of the report since the very first one in 1990. And Janet alluded also to the 94 report, 2014, report, and there have been others over the years that looked at themes related to environment, sustainability, resilience. So the theme is not new as such. what we thought was new was this moment that we are confronting that is described as the Anthropocene. And so we posed the question, what has led us to this situation or to this context? What are the fundamental drivers that led us to this point in time? And ultimately, all forms of life depend on energy and on materials to survive, to grow. And so this is the same with us humans. This is the same with human societies. So ultimately, the challenge that we confront, if we step back and go to the underlying roots, have to do with the way in which in industrial societies, we draw primarily on fossil fuels for energy and use materials in a way that is completely open-ended. So if you look at nitrogen use, for instance, which has enabled an agricultural revolution that has enabled us to feed the world today. It's the nitrogen cycle is facing a situation without precedent over the last 2.5 billion years in the history of the world. So I think it's important for us to bear in mind the duality of addressing both the energy challenge as well as the material challenge. And so in thinking about these two underlying drivers of these planetary pressures, we came up with the idea of contrasting the HDI with an index that accounts for greenhouse gases emissions and material footprint as a signal of the overextension in these two dimensions that are structurally determined by the way in which our industrial societies work. So the appeal here with this index, or the hope or the aspiration, is that it will lead to a rethinking of the very fundamental transformations that did need to take place in our economies, in our societies, that may be as dramatic as the ones that took place when we moved, for instance, from agricultural to industrial societies. So it's a big challenge, full of opportunity, as has been emphasized by Janet, Maha, and Khalida, but with also challenges that need to be confronted, especially looking at inequalities and the fact that many people could be left behind if they are not afforded opportunities to be part of this transformation in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Khalida, maybe a question for you. Questions around the state and the region, and maybe trying to understand why environment and sustainable issues have not always been popular or at the forefront of priorities in the region. Thank you very much. I think your microphone is muted. Sorry, Khalida.
Yes, sorry. So I was saying thank you because I need to leave the meeting quite soon. I have a crisis meeting on one of our difficult countries. I saw the question about the status in the region. First of all, there was no link between environment and economic opportunities. So, but now with all this crisis, I think it's visible, it's known. In terms of the implementation and the commitment of the government, beside one country, I will not name it, all of them have prepared their national climate plans. All their plans are very ambitious, and they have very well articulated sustainable energy plans with good progress in implementation. So on one hand, there is a growing recognition of countries of the climate threat, but also of the opportunities for sustainable energy transition and to low carbon. So on this, I think we are doing much better than before. We are also climate proofing human development and addressing food, water security as well. With this, if you allow me, Céline and colleagues, I have to leave you. It was a pleasure, and I hope for a better way where we can meet all together face to face. Merci. Shukran.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalida. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to continuing the implementation of this very important report. Thanks again. Maybe a question to Janet specifically. Do you think that the upcoming IMF climate strategy will have a positive impact to achieve SDG 13 on climate action? Over to you.
Well, I think I probably have to say I hope so, because it's upcoming and because actually we've seen good moves by our global institutions to try to support the issues that we're facing at the moment and you know, connect across to climate action. That one is still hypothetical because it's not out yet, but let me point to a couple of other things. For example, on the IMF side, recently at the spring meetings, they just agreed to an additional 650 million in special drawing rights, which are the elements that enable countries to be able to tide over these very difficult moments when they can't meet interest payments, for example. And the World Bank has also just announced that it's going to align its new operations with the Paris agreement by 2023 in only a couple of years' time. So these are both very welcome indications of an approach by the World Bank and the IMF that is looking at the real situations that we're facing and also trying to adjust their workings in the direction of climate action. So I think no institution operates on its own any more than a country can operate on its own when it comes to climate and development. So I think our institutions are responding in the right way. And yes, I have to be optimistic that the IMF upcoming climate strategy will have the right impact.
Thank you very much. Maha, maybe a question for you. COVID has exposed inequalities at the global level, especially nationalist protectionism rather than collaboration. And the person is asking the question saying vaccine distribution is a case in point. So maybe building on the point that you were making around regional cooperation, how do you think that, how can such an approach, the type of suggestions, recommendations that you were making before, help us face all the existential common problem that we are facing, including climate emergency? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Celine. I mean, water, just take the example of water. Without regional cooperation, you know, we're just going to have greater and greater challenges when it comes to water. Often rivers begin one place and end up in another. The tension between Egypt and Ethiopia is a case in point over the dam that is being built on the Nile today. So I think that without actual cooperation mechanisms, not just on specific issues related to climate, for example, water, but on a fundamental, on a number of other issues, things as basic as movements around the region. It's easier to travel outside the region than it is travel within the region. We're going back to some of really things that have been on the table for the past few decades. So to come back to your question, I mean, if we're moving into an age of Anthropocene, an age where humans, and certainly in this part of the region, I think humans have definitely shaped this region, and often for the worse, not for the better, in many ways. If you look at military spending versus social spending, for example, the only way forward is by reconsidering our priorities, reconsidering our options as a region, and figuring out how to move towards a more just, but also more equitable region where you don't have an even greater gap, not only within, but between countries, which is the situation today. Even now, it's cooperation over water issues, over cross-border challenges, refugee population migration, but even things like labor migration from one country to the other. The ability to take your pension with you from one country to the other is simply not there. And yet we're now in an era where people are just closing countries are closing their interests.
Thank you, Maha.
I think also digital
so
innovation. I mean, all of these are we live in a cross-border world. We don't live in an isolated, this region, I think something like 65% already is urbanized. And this will grow even more and more and more. The pressures of urbanization in and of themselves are significant. And addressing these issues is not going to happen at the national level only.
Thank you. I think this will conclude maybe some of the questions that we've received, because a lot of them were around some of the same issues. So thank you, colleagues and participants online for putting those questions to the panelists. And again, I think it's just the beginning of the conversation, and I think this is how this launch has been designed. I think this is a regional conversations, as Maha was highlighting, but also it's important that it trickles down, to the country, to the local level and to the community, so that, this is being absorbed, and also there is momentum towards implementation. So if I may try to conclude, which is always a very difficult task, I must say, but I will just try maybe to highlight maybe a few takeaways as far as I'm concerned, listening to what the Pedro provided in terms of an introduction, and also some of the contributions from our panel. Maybe a few things. I think first, this notion of this is not business as usual. I think we need to start from the acknowledgement that the fate of people and planet are intertwined, and I think it doesn't make sense today, to believe that we can choose between them. So either we save both or neither, and I think that needs to be very much the starting point for rethinking how we engage, and rethinking some of the priorities within countries, nations, but also between nations and at the regional level. So again, I think it was very clear from all interventions that we need to transform the way we think about human development and do things very differently. And I think there was a lot of different examples being offered, at the regional level, at the national level, and also at the local level, and also between states and within states, and the type of collaboration that also needs to be in place between governments and people. Third, and that builds on my last points, I think to address the many economic, social, and environmental pressures, I think government will need the support and engagement of people, private sector and civil society. I think this kind of emphasis on collaboration, on partnership, on inclusion, on the whole of society approach, I think it's very much needed, and I think underpin many of the contributions from our panels today. I think very much in line with the principles of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. I think that's at the core, and I think also linking very much with this promise of leaving no one behind. And then I guess for me, I think, sometimes, when we go back to maybe doing the work that we do every day, sometimes we doubt or we forget the urgency of the challenges that Pedro was talking to. And I think if there's any reminder to us that, it is important and it is essential that collectively we take steady, courageous, and bold steps to address some of the challenges that the 2020 Human Development Report puts out. It's last year, I think, what we've all experienced at personal, at a organizational, at a country level with COVID. I think this is the most urgent reminder that we need to do business differently. And that if we want to really move forward and reimagine the human development as we know it today, and how hopefully it will be done in the future, the time is now. So I'd like to thank you. I think it's always important to be reminded of the fundamentals of our work and of our life. And I think today was a good occasion for that. So let me thank again our distinguished presenter. I think thank you again, our panelists, for your time, for your contributions. Thanks again for Carnegie Middle East Center for joining us, and we look forward to further collaboration in the future. Our partner, the United Kingdom, for contributing to these discussions, and obviously all of us online that joined us, and I hope it has been an enriching experience. It has been for me. So thanks again, and have a good day.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.